In America, we constantly talk about race using color terms. You wouldn't really bat an eye if somebody says white, brown, or black. In fact, George Carlin uses them here as a way to do comedy.
So they killed a lot of white English people in order to continue holding black African people, so they can wipe out the rest of the red Indian people and move west and steal the rest of the land, the brown Mexican people, giving them a place to take off and drop their nuclear weapons on the yellow Japanese people.
But notice how he uses yellow as a way to describe Japanese people. That's not really a word you'd hear today. This term yellow has a long and complicated history. So, who is yellow? Am I yellow? Why is it so controversial? And should we even be using this word in the 21st century? Real quick before we start, if you're new to here, please like and subscribe. The Dopamine Rush really helps me release new content that you can enjoy. So, the term yellow people is a racial term. And to understand it, we need to understand the history of race itself, because race is man-made. Genetics shows that individuals vary more between each other than large social groups do. Races are being made up and redefined all the time. For instance, Irish people and Eastern Europeans in the past were not considered white, but now are. And while race is completely unscientific and should not exist, it has nonetheless willed itself into being as a social reality. So even if we don't want to live in a world where race exists, our social institutions have normalized it so much that it's basically inseparable from American history and society. And so, even if race isn't scientific, in America today, it matters. And one way it matters is how we talk about different types of people. In the past, there's been a lot of dehumanizing and hurtful language used against ethnic minorities, which brings us to the terminology of the yellow race. It might shock you to know that from the late medieval era, Europeans like Marco Polo were going to the east and calling Asians white. At the time, the concept that Asians constituted a distinct racial grouping alien from white Europeans and inferior to them was not yet established. That all begins to change, however, by the age of colonialism and imperialism. The gulf in economic development between Western Europe and East and Southeast Asia was becoming increasingly pronounced, and the hunger of European empires for new markets to exploit, combined with the stagnation and unwillingness of massive Asian empires to open up, meant that the West and East were on a course for a crash collision. Race theory often develops alongside economic needs to exploit non-white peoples. For instance, the genocide and enslavement of indigenous peoples in the New World, and then the mass enslavement of various West African peoples. The invention and propagation of the yellow racial label too was motivated by a desire to dehumanize and marginalize Asians. For instance, taxonomist Carl Linnaeus, among his other writings, classified Homo asiaticus as yellow, or luridus in Latin. And you also notice that he said Homo asiaticus, not Homo sapiens, because he believed Asians to be a separate species from white Europeans. And alongside the yellow trait, he also said that Asians were greedy, arrogant, rigid, melancholy, and governed by opinions. So we can see here, by using their yellowness, he's also communicating that Asians were alien and of negative qualities. And this culminated in the total redefinition of Asians into vile yellow aliens by the early 20th century. For instance, in 1920, famed scientist, racist author, and white supremacist Lothrop Stoddard, yes, that was his real name, wrote about the yellow man's desire to take over the civilized world in his book The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. This book really typifies the late 19th century and early 20th century fear of the Yellow Peril, wherein the Asian nations would outbreed and flood the Western world and cause its downfall. The differentiation of the yellow race was explicitly the portrayal of Asians as a threat to white civilization. Consequently, these had a direct impact on goading the racist and xenophobic pogroms such as the massacres and lynchings in Chinatowns in the western United States, and the passage of the Chinese and later Asian Exclusion Acts. Abroad, the difference between white European stock and yellow Asians was also used in both Australia and New Zealand to exclude and abuse Asians, as typified with the White Australia policy. Professor David Scott Caston writes, Asian people looked white to Western eyes mainly when they seemed to be candidates for conversion to Christianity. They became yellow only when they seemed to be a threat to Western moral values and economic interests. Imagine moral qualities somehow got mixed into the imagined color of their skin. They became yellow. A yellow that seemed sallow and sickly, darkened less by melanin than by misgivings. This set of associations projected Western anxieties and bias. Yellow became the color of corruption and cowardice, of duplicity, degeneracy, and disease. This yellow was a color produced by prejudice, not pigmentation. Around the Vietnam War, a collective identity began to arise among the peoples once classified as Mongoloid or yellow, that of Asian Americans. This arose in the midst of the 1960s counterculture that sought social and especially racial justice for marginalized peoples in the United States, with the Asian American movement seeking recognition and advancement of the united Asian community against racism and inequity. Before this, the yellow ethnicities of America, like Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese Americans, were consistently demonized together as yellow, but internally, they weren't actually perceived to really be a united cause. The label Asian American was in many ways effective in linking the diasporic community to Asia itself, which also garnered sympathy for the peoples of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which were at the time being attacked by the United States. More than that, it gave disparate peoples a common united umbrella identity that could serve as a way to bring small and divided ethnicities together. It wasn't this weird cartoon caricature that was thrust upon us like yellow, but it was a self-designated term that the community chose for itself. Asian has since become by far the most preferred label for the peoples that were once called yellow, but this has also become more inclusive of Americans descending from regions that happen to look different, for instance the South, Central, and West Asians. Later, Pacific Islander Americans would also advocate side by side with the Asian American community, leading to the modern additional recognition of the term AAPI. Nowadays, due to its racist origins, the term yellow is often seen as offensive, demeaning, and politically incorrect to use. Asian American advocacy groups tend to discourage the label. Yet some Asian Americans themselves, including those of Generation Z, sometimes controversially label themselves yellow or even embrace the word. John Chu said in 2018, "If we're going to be called yellow, we're going to make it beautiful." So if there are any arguments for revival or reclamation of the term yellow, what might they be? Well, one argument is that it weakens Asianness or foreignness. The reclamation of yellow has been argued by some to actually counter the persistent myth of the perpetual foreigner. Some proponents have said that the use of the term Asian means that we're always going to be seen as having allegiance to, or at least hailing from, a foreign continent. And it's a stigma that's actually avoided when you say white or black Americans instead of African or European Americans. People who think we should go back to saying yellow also say that using a color label could help us slowly decouple from the idea that we can't assimilate and will always be foreign. The potential rehabilitation of yellow has been proposed by some among us as a way to symbolize that the Asian community is ascending over past xenophobia and struggles. By reclaiming it, they argue that yellow is actually becoming a symbol of solidarity and endurance. But there's a lot to unpack regarding the label, and at least most Asians I know think it does more harm than good. The Asian American label works so well, and it's empowering because it unites a vast array of communities behind one collective umbrella that we can use for collective bargaining against the traditional exclusionary racial hierarchy of the United States. Yellow historically applied mainly to East and Southeast Asians. However, Asian Americans also include Desis and South Asians, West Asians, and Central Asians who don't really fit those stereotypes. Considering that many of these latter groups are also traditionally overlooked already, the adaptation of yellow again would only really serve to divide Asian Americans and exclude many types of them or sow unnecessary division. The labeling of various Asians as yellow was in the context of alienation and exploitation by white supremacists during the age of exploration, industrialization, and imperialism. It's been consistently used as a way to alienate us and make us look barbarous, different, and perpetually foreign. So by now I hope that this video has shown that yellow isn't a widely acceptable term for race like white people or black people. It came into being as a really charged term meant to make Asians seem strange, foreign, threatening, and okay to exploit or colonize. The worst abuses against Asians in the West historically, such as with the Yellow Pearl, White Australia, and the Chinese and Asian exclusion in the US, were all justified using this racist language, charged with all sorts of terms. Unfortunately, when it comes to sensitive issues like race and discrimination, words aren't always innocent, and they can have harmful histories. If you're Asian and you want to reclaim the term, you have that right, and maybe our culture could reconsider it. However, I wouldn't suggest it personally at this time. The historical usage has been most often as a way to alienate and dehumanize us, and if you're going to use yellow at all, which you should not if you aren't Asian, you should understand that history behind the word and think on it carefully. Okay, bye! 너를 만나 시작됐어 나의 사랑의 계절 내 맘 색깔은 yellow 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 해가 지나 또 이대로 너와 사랑을 계속 너의 미소는 yellow yellow yellow